Some people simply call it a book. Well, it's at least a collection of books, 66 to be exact. But even these can't really properly be called books. It's collections of writings of all kinds, spans over thousands of years. There's songs and poetry, proverbs and letters, biographies and oracles, these messages that claimed were directly from God himself. And then there's this genre called apocalyptic. And it collapses our categories of space and time, of physical and metaphysical. And it speaks of the world as though it's busting at the seams with the unseen, as though there's more than meets the eye. In fact, apocalyptic actually means unveiling, as though something's being peeled back so we can see beneath the surface what's been lurking there the whole time. Of course, there are histories or stories. They're narratives, but even those seem to stretch beyond the bounds of the time within which they're written. And they speak of the past as though it has some bearing on the present. They speak of the future as though they know where the future is going. So even these can't really be called histories, because history is just a record of events as they unfold. There's no direction, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's no author, there's no real hero. But this book claims all of those, and its history points forward into time and directly into the present moment. And so there's really only one proper title for this book, I think. It's not just a history book, and it's not just another story. It's the story of everything. So how did everything begin? Well, it began in the beginning. But there was something that was before the beginning, something that preceded time and space itself. In the beginning, God. And not just in the beginning God, but in the beginning God spoke. God said something. So from the very beginning we are introduced to a speaking God, a God who is connected with his creation through his word. And into the cosmic vibrations of the divine voice, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light, the creator and creation working in harmony together to accomplish his purposes. And then at the crown of his creation, he created humankind in his image. And what that boils down to, I think, is that God is the community who creates community. He is Father, Son, Holy Spirit. He says, "Let us make man in our image." In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. So from the very beginning, we see that image of God is itself relational. God himself is a relationship. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit coming together as a community to create community. And he extends that mission to us. In fact, he blessed us. The first blessing was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And you get this wonderful sense that this Creator God has really one ultimate intention with his creation, and that is he creates for the purpose of having more to love. And he's called us to do the same. And at the center of it all is this one single idea. It's the idea of family. God is creating for himself a family to be loved and to love. So he places them in the garden, a place of plenty, a place where there is no hunger, there is no pain, there are no tears, there is perfect relationship. And he says, "It's yours. Take, eat of all the trees of the garden." In Hebrew it literally says, "Eat, eat." But he did place one tree in the garden that was off limits. You see, there's a danger in every family. It's the danger of independence, the danger of pride. It's a danger of elevating the self above the relationship. And this, of course, was possible without the tree. The tree was just there to warn us about that problem. It was the only possible temptation within this perfect human freedom, within this perfect creation. So the tree was essentially a reminder of two things. The first was that though we'd been given dominion over all things, we had not been given dominion over God. He still had a particular order for his creation. And the second thing was, as his image bearers, we cannot live as islands unto ourselves. We cannot live in independence from God. We cannot liberate ourselves from God and from one another and continue to live. And so the tree was placed there to spell out the conditions of the natural order. To be human, to be in the image of God, meant to be in relationship with God, in relationship with one another. We should not be surprised then when this tempter, this serpent enters the story, that he tempts us on those two fronts. He speaks to Eve as an individual. He speaks to her with the temptation of becoming like God, based on a different criteria. She would know good and evil for herself. She would be able to make judgments about what was good for her own life, rather than trusting in God for those judgments. And of course, the sad irony of all this is that in tempting her to become like God, she'd forgotten that she was already like God with her husband. And so she eats of the fruit, declares her independence, and then her husband follows. It was nuclear fission within the nuclear family, and that splitting has been reproducing itself ever since. Sin enters the world. The first effect of sin is felt on the ground. They cover themselves with fig leaves. It was the first divorce. And then they hide in the trees from God. And God comes looking for them and says, "Adam, where are you?" And of course, God knew where Adam was. But so begins the theme of humans running from God and God going after humans. And he calls out to Adam to indicate not that he can't find him, but to indicate that he was lost. That Adam had lost himself, he had lost God. Adam begins to make excuses. It was the woman that you gave me. He's already begun to place himself above the relationship, as though the relationship can be split up like that. When only a chapter earlier he sang the first song, "Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh," and now she becomes a scapegoat. And she points down the line at the devil. "The devil made me do it." That excuse enters the world. And with that, the first systematic human creation was established. It was a hierarchy of human sin. It will take many forms and become quite sophisticated throughout history, but it's all one grand illusion, because it suggests that little sins put a little bit of distance between you and God, and only big sins put big distance between you and God. And of course, the distance between you and God in your sin is infinite. So he looks down and focuses on the distance between him and her, like the distance between a tidal wave and a ripple in a pond. But the real distance is between all the waves in the sea and the moon they are trying to reach. And unless that moon one day plunges into the heart of the abyss, there's no hope of reunion. But there is perhaps a foreshadowing of such a reunion. But it's hard to know what to make of it at this point. But he calls a lamb, the whitest lamb in the garden, a lamb without spot or blemish. It obeys. It comes in silence. They want to look away, but he won't let them look away. He makes them watch. They had to see the cost of their sin. A lamb of sorrows. Your transgressions, his wounds. His chastisement, your peace. His stripes, your healing. You have strayed, but he has come to be slaughtered for your iniquity, innocent, but numbered among sinners. The white wool now forever stained in a dark crimson that would forever be the color of guilt and the color of grace, the color of the intersection. The intersection where God unites with sinners, where human guilt is covered by the sacrifice of God. God would eventually form a nation around this intersection. He would become its very king, and he would place that intersection in the heart of their worship. Behind a curtain, the tablets of the law would be placed under the mercy seat, the only seat fit for God in a fallen world. But much happens between now and then. And the first thing is they are sent out of the garden to the east. So God sent them out of his garden, this place where there would be no tolerance for pride and for selfishness, and they are left to fend for themselves, to see what life is like east of Eden, in independence from God, independence from one another. And from that moment on, the narrative begins to unravel, and humans begin to turn on themselves. This human family becomes obsessed with self-preservation, and violence becomes the means of ensuring it. The world is becoming eclipsed east of Eden, so much so that God eventually has to wipe out all but one family to recommence with his family project. And so he orders Noah to go with his household into the ark, and he baptizes the world, cleansing it of its sin by way of judgment. So he started fresh, but not completely fresh. The scent of the olive branch the dove brought to Noah still stunk of another tree. So they emerged from the ark, and it says they came out by families from the ark. Even the beasts and the snakes and the birds and the worms, God's vision for the world, for the family, is being restored. The multiplication of violence has been halted. The blessing to multiply is again given. Semblances of the garden vision can be seen, but they're seen through the lingering clouds. The rainbow shines against the backdrop of darkness. Noah's family portrait appears awkward, somewhat contrived. It's like that forced annual family picture in a home where 364 days out of the year it's filled with hostility. But the parents need to send out a Christmas card. So they gather their kids around, tell them all to smile. The invisible lines of tension take shape in the eyes of the parents. The hiddenness and anxiety of shame stiffen the bodies and cross the arms of the children. Everyone is protecting himself, herself. Family could erupt at any moment. Proximity is not the same as unity. But God saw the portrait for what it was. He knew all was provisional. He knew human propensity. He knew the human heart was bent eastward like an iron arrow. Humankind could be purged of its evil men, but not from its evil seed. So God would not begin where Adam began. He would begin where Adam left off, not in Eden, but in the east. There's no command to avoid acquiring the knowledge of evil out here. The knowledge of evil is already known. Its seeds already deeply implanted. If anything, it was good that men struggled to remember. So because of the hardness of their hearts, God made provisions. God allowed that human thirst for blood be quenched with animals. Men had become beasts at heart. The eyes of a lion scouting the land for its prey will eventually turn in on its pride. So it is with man and his pride. Beasts will feed on anything in their pride. So it was not an entirely new creation, but a consolation creation, with looming shadows of its future stretching forward in time. The reader looks at the scene like one looks at a fire after someone throws in a can of hairspray, standing back, face cringed, just waiting for the inevitable. There is some consolation, however, because God makes a covenant with Noah and to all his descendants to never destroy the earth again with a flood. It was a promise within which lay a deeply embedded prediction. Flooding would not become a cycle of global destruction, but men would continue to walk that same circular path. God would not purge the world with water, but the world would need again to be purged. This cryptic prediction was that nothing was actually changing in the East. The seeds were still tainted, the ground still cursed. The promise was not about what men would do and not do, but about what God would do and not do. Men were not dependable, only God. While the evil way of man would follow that same predictable pattern, God's way of dealing with this evil would not take its cues from the circle. God's way is always a straight line. We will return to the west, but not by circling back. God does not undo, He redeems. Creation would return to goodness, but not because of its own turning. The westerly way of God somehow takes us straight through the wilderness of the East. It's only upon reaching the other side that we will realize that God had turned creation on its head, that somehow what people intended for harm, God uses for good. For now, we will simply begin to see that this Creator was far more drastic, far more radical, far more surprising, far more gracious in His restoration plot than we would have ever imagined. And in this case, it's enough to know that human history can continue eastward without cowering at every drop of rain.